So the question we want to look at today is mistakes and contradictions in the Bible. Are there any? I think that's a good question. I think that's a fair question to ask. And I guess the crux of that question really centers around what is called the doctrine. Doctrine just means teaching. Around the doctrine of inerrancy or infallibility of the Scripture. The inerrancy and infallibility of the Bible. Simply put, is the Bible without error? The basic argument being, if the perfect God wrote the Scriptures or inspired the writing of it, the Scriptures should be perfect. Therefore, there should be no mistakes. So what's the difference between inerrant and infallible? What's the difference? Well, inerrant means that there are no errors. Infallible means there can be no errors. So as we jump into this, an interesting thing, a little side note, an interesting thing to know is that some scholars would argue, and I think convincingly, that the Bible itself does not actually claim anywhere inerrancy or infallibility, which is an interesting discussion for sure. Also, what is meant by inerrant and infallibility means different things to different scholars. The definitions, I've got to say, are wide and broad. So it really is a very big subject, more than we can really develop in the scope of this series. Generally, though, I want to walk through this next statement very slowly, but when Christian theologians say the Bible is without error or inerrant, they generally mean that when all the facts are known, the Scripture as they were penned by the authors in the original writings and as properly interpreted will be shown to be true and not false in all they affirm. It stands to reason, right? If God is actually the author of Scripture, if he inspired certain men to reveal his words, it's reasonable to think that he would not contradict himself. It's reasonable to think that his word would be error-free. And I want to tell you, I can agree with that reasoning. So does the Bible have mistakes? Does the Bible have contradictions? Of course, the critics say yes, there are thousands of errors and contradictions in the Bible. But is that really true? Now, because the battle for the book is not new and has raged, and when I say raged, I mean raged through the centuries. For instance, critics fairly point out things like in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 28, verses 2 and 3, it says that there was one angel at Jesus' tomb. At the time of his resurrection, there was one angel at Jesus' tomb. But in Luke 24, verse 4, speaking of the same event, it refers to two angels being there. Critics say this is a contradiction. This is a mistake. Well, is it? But here, I want you to understand there is more here than meets the eye. But the first thing we need to understand is the nature of the four Gospels. The nature of the four Gospels, which, if you're new to the Bible, are the first four books in the New Testament canon of Scripture: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So these four Gospels, and the word gospel simply means good news. These four Gospels are really, what are they? Four different perspectives of the life of Jesus. They're from four different authors, from four different backgrounds. For example, Matthew was a Jew, Luke was a Gentile. Gentile just as a non-Jew. So they saw the world in a different way. Now, when we look at our modern Bibles or the Bible we have on our phone app and so on, in modern Bibles, the heading at the beginning of each gospel just says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But if you look at older versions of the Bible, like the Authorized King James Version, it will have the words at the beginning of each gospel. You can maybe go back and look at it right now, but it will have these words: the gospel according to, so the good news, the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Luke. So each gospel account is going to be different. And of course, if they were all the same, people would just say, oh, they just copied them off each other. But again, these are different perspectives from different people. So let's look at the two scriptures in question. In Matthew's gospel, it says, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone. In Luke's gospel, it says, while they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. So which one is it? Is it one or is it two angels? Just because Matthew's gospel mentions the one angel, that does not mean that the other angel was not there. From Luke, we can clearly see there were two. The truth is that most apparent contradictions can be explained. Like I've already said, there's a myriad of books like this one, The 3 Days and the 3 Nights. There's a myriad of books that dig deep into every question and doubt raised. And here's the thing, most arguments brought up are usually common ones. They're not new ones. It's like, oh, there's a new one. No, look, many of the questions presented have already been asked and answered before. Also remember, because we are dealing only with copies of the original manuscripts and not the manuscripts, the originals themselves, there are copying errors. There are copying errors. And if one error is made in copying down a manuscript, it makes sense. All future manuscript copies are going to reproduce that error. But here's what you need to know, and this is important. Here's what you need to know. When you examine the errors, as many learned experts have done over the centuries, over the years, it is clear how they were made and that they do not alter the intended meaning of the text. For example, I'll give you some examples. Some manuscripts of the New Testament spell the name John with one N. Other times it is spelled with two N's. This technically constitutes an error, right? Now get this. Whenever a particular error like this occurs, say this error, the two N's, occurred in 3,000 manuscripts, that would be counted. That type of error would be counted as 3,000 mistakes. 3,000 errors, if you like. But of course, that type of error in no way changes the meaning of God's words. It's clearly a copying error. In 2 Chronicles 22, verse 2, most manuscripts say that King Uzziah was 22 years old when he took over the reign from his father, Joram. But in 2 Kings 8:26, some other manuscripts report that he was 42. Well, what was he, 42 or 22? Which one was it? Well, the reality is he couldn't have been 42. How do we know this? Because his father, Joram, it tells us in 2 Kings 8, verse 17, died at 40. And so logically, he can't be 2 years old. He cannot be 2 years older than his father. So it's a copying error. So as we sum this up, what do we need to know? Although there are differences in manuscripts, not one fundamental Christian doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. When all the facts are known, the scriptures as they were penned by the authors in the original writings and properly interpreted will be shown to be true and not false in all they affirm.